Thank you very much. Reminder, turn off the cell phones, right? Oh, wait a minute, I gotta take this. Hello, Rudy? Oh, man, I told you, I'm busy talking. No, I'm not gonna endorse you. No, you got no invasion of Iran, pull the troops out immediately out of Iraq. I'm sorry, that's it. No, don't call me till then. All right, thanks, sorry about that. All right, in 2005, I went with Sean Penn and Norman Solomon to cover the Iranian presidential elections. And that was in June. Sean Penn did not go as an actor, but as a journalist to report for the San Francisco Chronicle. He ended up writing a 5-part series. And basically, I helped him set up the trip and set up the interviews and so on. So we spent a lot of time together. And one of the things I wanted him to see was the Tehran Bazaar. Those of you who have been to Tehran know it. It's kind of one of the world's first shopping centers and shopping malls. You go kind of down this incline, and you can buy everything there, from food to pirated DVDs, home appliances, women's sexy lingerie, you name it. And we were down there, and Norman and I were interviewing one merchant, and Sean was off talking to somebody else. And Sean kind of came over to join us. And the merchant looked at him and he said, you know, your friend, he looks just like Sean Penn. Yeah, I can't believe, oh my God, it is Sean Penn. And he says, I know, I've seen all your movies. I just saw The Interpreter. Now, The Interpreter had just come out at that time and was just come out in the United States and was already available on a pirated DVD in Iran, right? So he'd already seen the movie. And he says, I know all about you. You used to be married to Madonna. So here we come. We come 3,000 miles to ask the Iranians about serious questions about nuclear power and U.S.-Iranian relations, and they want to know about Madonna. And it does reveal something very interesting, which is anybody who has been to Iran, any American, will tell you that people are extremely friendly to Americans. They really want to talk with you. You can be invited over to a complete stranger will come up and invite you over to their house for dinner. They want to know both. They're friendly, but they also want to know what the U.S. has in mind for Iran. And they want to tell you how critical they are of Bush. So in my case, I said, yes, okay. And the same kind of thing in interviews of people on the street. So for example, at one point I was doing a story about the Iranian film industry and TV and so on. So I was asking people at random in a working class neighborhood, and we found some women with a chador, conservatively dressed. I said, what's your favorite films? What's your favorite TV? And she answered one or two, and then she says, why are you asking me about films? Why aren't you asking me about inflation? Do you know how high the inflation here? And she just went on a rip against the government and the high unemployment and the high level of inflation, et cetera. And what she was, what was indicative of was that there is tremendous discontent in Iran. There is not a lot of happiness with the government, but everything that the Bush administration is doing is making it worse for the people inside Iran who are trying to make change. And I will come back to that a bit in a moment. But I want to switch scenes now. I flew from Tehran to Erbil in northern Iraq. It's the Kurdish region, the KRG, or the Kurdish regional government. And it's really interesting that the cheapest, most reliable, and easiest form of transportation into northern Iraq is from Iran. You can fly from Jordan and sometimes from Turkey, but it's unreliable and it's very expensive. The transportation from Iran is regular and reliable. And that tells you something, because someday we're going to hear about, how the Iranian government is infiltrated in Kurdistan or something like that. They've had very long-standing friendly ties. There's a lot of economic trade and so on. And of course, the United States is trying whatever they can do to disrupt that. So the reason I went to to the KRG, was to make contact with all the Iranian Kurdish groups that are in exile there. There are 3 groups. They all have Peshmerga or militias, but 2 out of the 3 are not engaged in any armed struggle inside Iran right now. But one of them is, and more about them in just a moment. But the key thing to understand about the KRG is that it's a hotbed of spies. There are intelligence agents and spies and gun runners and all manner of people of ill repute running around. It's like something out of an old Graham Greene novel, or some kind of a end of the Ottoman Empire novel. Everything is there except the guys with the fezzes. And the Americans are spying on the Iranians are spying on the Turks are spying on the Kurds, and the Kurds are spying on the Americans. And they all meet in one cafe. And that's the cafe of a hotel that I was staying at in Sulaymaniyah, which is the second largest city there. And it's a hotel. One of the things that Saddam Hussein did was pretty much tear down all of the old architecture of his country and put up really ugly concrete. So this hotel was like Saddam modern, seriously ugly concrete. And in the lobby, they had a little cafe, little tables. And everybody sits around, and you can get a hookah, or a hubbly bubbly and smoke fragrant tobacco if that's your want. But everybody drinks this really strong black tea. And they serve it in a glass that's about this big. And imagine boiling hot water poured into a glass like that. And there's no cup holder, right? Like in some countries. So I'm trying to learn the cultural traditions of every country that I go to. And I was trying to figure out how to drink this stuff. So if you pick it up this way, it's impossible. It's really hot, right? So I tried picking it up by the top rim, but that was too hot. So I kind of looked around and I tried to figure out how everybody else was doing it. And what you do is you take it, somehow you pour a little bit into your saucer. And you let the tea cool that way. And then you slurp it. So you go, and you look at who's spying you over here, and you go, and you're trying to figure out who's looking at you over here. And that's how we proceeded I learned to drink tea properly in Sulaymaniyah. This is all true stories. I'm a journalist. I do not make this stuff up. So after leaving that hotel one day, I ran into some American guys that they were dressed in civilian clothing, but they were clearly military by their bearing and their haircuts. And I went in and chatted them up. And it turns out they were, special forces, Green Berets, intelligence officers, i.e. spies, who were there living off the base. The U.S. has a military base in Sulaymaniyah, or just outside. But they're living in town, and their job is to spy. And as I got more deeply into it, the United States has backed the Kurdish government there since the end of the first Gulf War in the early 90s, and they've established quite a apparatus. And in order to really understand that, I had to go high up into the Kandil Mountains, which is the mountain range that borders Turkey and Iraq and Iran. And there's a group up there of Kurdish guerrillas called the PKK, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party. It's led by a guy named Abdullah Öcalan, who's in prison in Turkey. The group is listed as a terrorist organization on the U.S. State Department list of terrorist organizations. And when these folks attack from Iraq into Turkey, they're denounced by the United States as terrorists. They conduct guerrilla raids, they blow up buildings, they ambush soldiers, etc. And the Turks are completely outraged and furious about this, and they continually threaten to invade northern Iraq to go after the guerrillas. Now, the same organization, with a different name, also fights in Iran. It's called PJAK, but it's very closely affiliated with the PKK. PJAK means the Party of Free Life. And they're the same organization of Iranian Kurds who go into Iran, they shoot the Revolutionary Guards, they blow up buildings, etc., and they are supported by the United States of America with arms and with training. They're also supported by the Israelis. Now, one side of the border, terrorists. Other side of the border, exactly same tactics, freedom fighters. This is how the United States pays back Iran, and it's very interesting that what the U.S. accuses, the U.S. is doing to Iran precisely what it accuses of Iran doing inside Iraq. And it's not just in the Kurdish region, but in Baluchistan, which is the southeast part of Iran close to the Pakistani border. There's another ethnic minority, the Baluchis. And there's a group the U.S. has managed to find a group called Jondola, which it pays to carry out terrorist raids against Iran. And Jondola's leader just happens to be a former leader of the Taliban. So, you know, evil, remember Osama bin Laden, dead or alive, we're going to get him, he blew up the World Trade Center, and he's closely allied with Taliban, etc. The U.S. is paying the guy, the very same kind of people, I'm not saying he has direct ties with Osama bin Laden, but people of the same ideology to attack Iran. And I could go into details that throughout the various ethnic parts of Iran, regions of Iran, the U.S. is doing the same kind of thing. And the theory is that you carry out these terrorist attacks, the Iranian government represses the people, they get angry and rise up or otherwise cause a great deal of trouble for the central government. And of course, the ethnic minorities of Iran face real oppression. It is not some strange myth that they have. They are denied many of their cultural rights, language rights, any kind of genuine democracy, etc. And they have legitimate grievances against the central government. But of course, what this does is promote a kind of separatism that some neocons in this country even talk about the necessity to split apart Iran because they can't win over the whole government. They're too strong in Tehran, so you break off pieces of it, which of course would be an absolute disaster. So that's simply a bit of a backdrop, that the U.S. is carrying out a covert war against Iran with the full support of the administration and of top-level Democrats in the United States. That when it comes to people like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and John Edwards, not to mention Nancy Pelosi, etc., there's no significant difference on their policy towards Iran from those of the Republicans. And everybody supports cranking up economic pressure, political pressure in the UN, more sanctions, tougher sanctions, secret war against Iran. The only place some of them differ is about whether we should immediately bomb Iran, and I will come back to that in a moment. But there's three major arguments that the U.S. makes, both Democrats and Republicans, as to why Iran presents such an immediate danger that we have to do something about it, and therefore all these tactics are justified. The first, of course, is that Iran is about to develop a nuclear weapon. And actually, if you go to Washington and talk to people, or if you go to talk to even leading Democratic liberals or major media, you know, writers for the New York Times or others, they will tell you, of course, Iran is developing a nuclear weapon. That's just a given. Now, there may be some dispute about how soon they have, but of course they're developing a nuclear weapon. There's only one small flaw in that. The U.S. has never proven that, in fact, they are. The CIA and other National Security Agency and others have issued what's called an NIE, a National Intelligence Estimate. And they wrote one in February of this year. And the Bush administration didn't like, this is about Iran, and included its nuclear program. And the Bush administration didn't like it, so they sent it back for a rewrite. And it was rewritten. They didn't like that one, so they sent that one back for a rewrite. And here we are in the middle of October, still no NIE publicly available, or the summary of it publicly available. And the reason for that is because they didn't toe the line on how much of a danger Iran is with its nuclear weapons. They're apparently, the leak is that it's at least 5 years away. And they've, you know, the thing to keep in mind is the U.S. has consistently said Iran is 5 years away from having a nuclear weapon since the 1980s, and they still don't have one. And again, for details, check out my book. I give you the citations of every time that somebody in the administration has leaked that. It turns out it's very complicated to develop a nuclear weapon. And even people with nuclear power and full ability to enrich their own uranium, it's very hard to do it. And even if somehow you do manage to enrich a very small amount of uranium, which is the most the Iranians could conceivably do in the foreseeable future, you still don't, how do you put it on a missile or otherwise make it actionable as a weapon? That takes a whole other set of technology. And the CIA knows this, and the Israeli intelligence knows this. But it's easier to hype up Iran as this tremendous threat. There's exactly one organization in the world that can tell you whether Iran is developing nuclear bomb or not, and that's the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, run by Mohammed al-Baradei. You may remember that he was right about Iraq, that there was no nuclear program in Iraq prior to 2003, in that period. And of course, for being right, the U.S. tried to get him fired so that he would not have his position renewed at the IAEA. And he fought back. The international community backed him, and he won a Nobel Peace Prize that year for his work. So he's the same guy who's trying to tell us now. He and the IAEA have never said that Iran has a nuclear program. It's very hard to figure that out from all the propaganda that comes out in the US media, but the IAEA has never said that Iran is developing a nuclear program. And in fact, a couple months ago, they signed an agreement in which Iran agreed to answer a bunch of questions that it had, because there are questions about what it had done in the past, and to allow full inspection of all their nuclear sites. So if you think they're doing something, you go in there, you can take water samples and soil samples and all kinds of things. They can tell if somebody is enriching uranium beyond the level that they're supposed to, that would indicate they're trying to go for nuclear weapons. So you'd think, oh, well, that's great. They've signed an agreement, give it a chance to work. So what's the Bush administration reaction? Condemning Mohammed al-Baradei once again for engaging in diplomacy, for undercutting the UN somehow. I mean, it's this twisted logic, because anybody who doesn't go along with the Bush plan is obviously doing something horribly, horribly wrong, and they're not interested in actually resolving the issue about nuclear weapons or nuclear power. They want an excuse to overthrow the government of Iran, and al-Baradei is undercutting that. The second major argument is that Iran is a major source of weapons for Iraq, and that they're responsible for killing many, many American soldiers. They never tell you exactly how many. And every day we get new charges. Iranian missiles were found, and the Iranian ambassador to Iraq is a Revolutionary Guard agent, and we've arrested this guy. Whoops, he turned out to be a merchant. Sorry, we unarrested him, but we arrested this guy who probably is doing something or another. And all of this rhetoric is just kind of hyped up every day. Literally every day we're getting new charges and allegations. And it's kind of hard to keep up with them all, because they're usually saying, we found all these missiles that must have come from Iran, but they never show you the missiles. Does this ring any bells about a little something that you do to kind of whip people up and you don't actually have any proof for it? Let's take the examples of the ones that they have shown us. The famous EFPs, or explosively formed penetrators. What they are is metal discs. They are machined. They allegedly are so sophisticated they can only come from Iran. You put an explosive charge underneath them, you put it on the ground or bury it in the ground, it explodes and sends up a charge of the copper, almost bullet-like object into armor and destroys the armor. It's very effective as a guerrilla attack against enemy armor. And these are being used effectively in Iraq, and they have to have come from Iran, and that's proof positive that the Iranians are trying to kill American soldiers. Several flaws when you actually look into this. And this has been widely reported in the British press, not so widely reported in the American press. A, those EFPs were first used by the IRA in Northern Ireland, and the Irish Republican Army. It's an old guerrilla tool. It's not something that Iran came up with. It's been used in Lebanon and other parts of the Middle East, again, unconnected to Iran. You can, if you're a mining company, you can buy these things commercially and use them for your explosives to, like, loosen rock or whatever you need to do in your mining operations. And they can be and are machined in Iraqi machine shops around Iraq. So there's nothing special or unique that says every time you find one of these things it must have come from Iran. That's just a myth propagated by the US. What is Iran doing in Iraq? Well, it's very interesting. Iran has very long-standing ties with 3 out of the 4 of the major factions that run the government of Iraq, that are the elected, allegedly democratically elected leaders of Iraq. And the ties go back for years. So the Dawa Party, which is al-Maliki, the prime minister, SIRI, what used to be called SCIRI is now called SIK, which is the second leading parliamentary party, still has their headquarters in Tehran. I visited it. You can go to their office building with their headquarters in Tehran. And the Kurds, aforementioned easy flights and all that. Jalal Talabani speaks fluent Farsi. He's the president of Iraq because he spent so much time in Iran during exile. And Barzani, which is the other leading Kurdish leader, also has very close ties with the Iranians. So the Iranians are supporting, and these are all people the United States supports. So U.S. is funding and shipping arms to these people, so are the Iranians. Iranians, ironically, are supporting many of the same parties that the United States is supporting. And there's one exception, and that's Muqtada al-Sadr and the al-Badr brigades. We hear a lot about them. But he's called a ceasefire against the United States, which the United States acknowledges in general as being carried out. So I have a question to you. if the U.S. is supporting virtually the same parties as the Iranians are supporting, but everybody's supplying them weapons, who is the United States fighting in Iraq? Any ideas? Saudi Arabia, thank you very much. That's the first time I heard that one. Yeah, well, I mean, what it comes down to is the United States is fighting the Iraqi people. It's not fighting Iran, it's not fighting Al-Qaeda. And there's different factions, and depending on the maneuvering that's going on, almost on a day-to-day and certainly on a month-to-month basis, the former Baathists that the U.S. had denounced as the terrorists in the beginning of the war, they're now making an alliance with them. Some of the Shia parties that the U.S. backed in the elections are now shooting at the U.S. So this has to do with the internal politics of Iraq and the nature of an occupation, not because these groups are getting orders from Iran. So despite anything that you may have heard or read, the U.S. has never been able to prove that the Iranian government is shipping arms to Iraq with the intention of killing American soldiers. It's simply a myth, and it's the most convenient argument that seems to gain traction domestically in the United States. Just like the United States decided to invade and occupy Iraq, and they needed a reason. So they tried various reasons, and finally weapons of mass destruction. That seemed to work, so they just hyped that to the end, and of course it was completely false. And some months, years down the line, we'll find out it was the same process about these evil weapons killing American soldiers in Iraq. Say again? Get them out of Iraq. Yeah, get the troops out of Iraq, and they won't be killed. Yeah, there's that solution. And then finally, the third argument that probably resonates very deeply, certainly for myself and for the Jewish community, which is, okay, Iran is led by a Hitler. He is a man who wants to eliminate the Jewish state, wipe it off the map, kill the Jewish people, and to have a nuclear weapon in the hands of a madman like this is unthinkable. So we have to do something. And the open policy of the Israeli government is to advocate the bombing of Iran, and either by themselves or by the United States. That's the official position. And that view is backed up very strongly by supporters of Israel in this country, neoconservatives, Christian Zionists, a coalition of various forces. The reality of it is that it's not true. And what's more and what's worse is the leadership in Israel knows that it's not true. How do we know this? This slogan that, we're going to wipe Israel off the map, first of all, is a conscious mistranslation of a very old slogan that Ayatollah Khomeini first used back in the 80s. You can find this slogan in Farsi on the side of the U.S. Embassy, where the student hostages, remember the whole issue was taken back in the early 80s. It's been there for years. The paint is faded, so we know it's an actual slogan that's been there for a long time. And it more accurately is translated as, the regime in Jerusalem should vanish from the pages of time. Do you see the difference in that translation? One implies an active action by some person or people to wipe out Israel, and the other is saying that the Israeli government is not legitimate. And so what they're saying is, and what Ahmadinejad's position is that there should be a one-state solution. That is, all the Israelis, all the Muslims, all the Palestinians who are living in exile should return to Israel, and Muslims, Jews, and Christians should vote, and whatever state they vote for, it should be democratically elected. Now, that's a far cry from wipe Israel off the map. It's not acceptable to the Israelis. And the actual position of much of the Arab world and the majority of Palestinians is for a two-state solution, Israel alongside Palestine. But that's a separate question from saying that Iran advocates the wiping off the map of Israel. Now, all right, let's say, you're quibbling about translations, and how can we trust this guy? And this guy denies the Holocaust, and clearly something, he is another Hitler. Well, even if, let's say, you don't agree with anything that I've said up till now, you have to ask yourself a question. If Iran is truly such a danger to Israel, and it's had the same policy towards Israel, this rhetoric is not new. Ahmadinejad has not said anything worse, qualitatively worse than the previous leaders of Iran. Why hasn't Iran attacked Israel already with conventional weapons? They have the missiles, they have the bombs, they have the airplanes. They could attack Israel tomorrow if they were so inclined. Why don't they? A, because it's not their policy. They never intend to launch an offensive attack against Israel. And B, if they did, it would guarantee the absolute destruction of the state of Iran. Israel would retaliate immediately. The United States would retaliate, probably some European countries. The Iranian nation would be destroyed, and along with the Iranian leadership. And they may be, and they are indeed angry leaders in Iran, but they're not crazy. And Israel knows this, and the United States knows this. But once again, you try to find an emotional argument that's going to tug at people to make them angry enough to go out and want to do something. So what is Iran's policy towards Israel? By the way, I have to say, Ahmadinejad is a poster boy for everything that could possibly go wrong to trying to defend Iran against aggression from the United States. When there is a sector of people who are anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish, and when he says that he doesn't quite deny the Holocaust, but what he says is that he questions the Holocaust, and there needs to be more study. Well, I've heard that argument before about people who question whether evolution is scientific fact, and maybe we should explore more about intelligent design. When they say that about evolution, they're saying they believe in creationism. And I'm sorry, the Holocaust is a reality. Ahmadinejad is wrong, and actually he's pretty roundly condemned even inside Iran, not to mention among Iranians outside the country. So that's not even a majority position, even among the elite in Iran. But him saying that certainly gives lots of ammunition to the Israelis and their supporters. The real reason that Israel is upset about Iran is because they're supplying economic, political, and military support to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Israel fought and lost a war against Hezbollah last August, and because they support politically and economically Hamas in the Palestinian territories. And just like the United States has to find somebody, some outside agitator to blame for our problems in Iraq. Oh, it's not what we're doing in Iraq, it's Al-Qaeda, it's Iran. So Israel has to find some outside force to blame for the trouble with the Palestinians and the fact that they're continuing to occupy Arab land. So they blame Iran. And so the theory is if you get rid of Iran or weaken it significantly, then you can go after Hezbollah and Hamas, and somehow Israel will be more secure. And the way to do this is to bomb Iran. Well, exactly the opposite is the case. If anybody, first of all, Israel is not going to bomb Iran by itself. It can't militarily, and politically it would be impossible to do so. If anybody's going to do it, it's going to be the United States. And if the United States does that, it will absolutely make the situation of Israel far, far worse, not to mention the people of Iran, not to mention the people of the United States and around the world. Because the plan is, and these are plans that have been, again, if you haven't seen Seymour Hersh's article in The New Yorker, I very much urge you to do so. And I think it's still the current issue, but anyway, it was available last week. And he goes into great detail from intelligence sources that the U.S. is planning to bomb the nuclear facilities, Revolutionary Guard headquarters, Revolutionary Guard training camps, et cetera, including office buildings in Tehran, which means you're going to have collateral damage, i.e. civilians killed. They're talking about inserting U.S. troops into Iran to destroy certain targets and then pull them out, not to stay and occupy. But it would be a disaster. It would be a disaster because the Iranians would retaliate in all kinds of ways, not by a conventional war against the United States, which they would lose, but there would now, you think American soldiers are getting killed in Iraq? Wait until they attack Iran, and everybody in Iraq is suddenly united against the United States, and they're all shooting at the United States. Hezbollah and Israel could very well get into another war with a second front from Hamas, and that's why I mean it would be a disastrous policy for Israel, because more Israelis are going to get killed in the process of that. And the danger exists of terrorist attacks taken up in various parts of Western Europe, or even in the United States, in retaliation for that. So it's a very, very dangerous situation. It's not, I'm again not saying that the decision has absolutely been made to go to war against Iran in that way, but it's the most dangerous situation I've seen, certainly in the last 20 years, in terms of the danger of that happening. So the critical question to me is, what do we do about it? Because sometimes, and I've talked to a lot of groups like this, people get really depressed. It's like, wait a minute, we were out marching 3 years ago against the war in Iraq, and they invaded Iraq. And now They got more troops in Afghanistan, and now they're going to attack another country. I think I'm just going to go home, crawl into bed, and pull the covers up over my head and forget about the whole thing, right? Which, of course, helps who? The Bush administration. I remain a sober realist, a sober optimist. The situation is serious, but I do have hope, and I want to explain to you why. Because the reason it's not a done deal that the U.S. is going to attack Iran is that there is a very fierce debate within the administration and within Washington, including some opposition in Congress, not anywhere near what it should be, but there is some. Secondly, the allies are very much split on this, U.S., European allies I'm talking about. The rest of the world is completely opposed to it. So whatever allies the U.S. might have once had, or forget it on this one. But in Europe, Germany is strongly opposed to it. Russia and China are strongly opposed to it. That's why they won't back the UN in the U.S. in a UN vote that they thought they were going to get. Germany is opposed to it. Britain is equivocal on it. And Sarkozy is leaning towards Bush. And isn't it interesting now? France, our historic allies, the wonderful people we fought to arm in arm in World War II. Why don't we hear any of that anti-French rhetoric now, I wonder? Because Sarkozy, they want Sarkozy on their side if they can get him. But even there's some differences. And again, I refer you to your to that Cy Hirsch article. So there are these differences, and they are real, and they are impediments. And don't forget the American people. Despite everything the Bush administration would want you to believe, they do pay attention to petition campaigns and demonstrations. They do pay attention to things like October 27. I think it's important to have as big a turnout as possible. You can get here to New York. I'll be out in San Francisco. There's demonstrations planned throughout the country. I think that's an important event that if you haven't been to anything this year, get out to that anti-war demonstration. Organize a contingent of people opposing U.S. bombing of Iran. I know that's going to be happening in San Francisco and the Iranian community out there. And after the demonstrations, there's lots of kind of organizing to do. The city council, there's an effort to get local city councils to vote to oppose a U.S. Intervention in Iran. In Oakland, she mentioned that October 2nd was Reese Erlich Day. So I took advantage of it. I had no idea, what do you do on Reese Erlich Day, right? So I had various ideas, actually. I thought I could issue proclamations. I thought it was worth a try. So I had to visit my dentist that day, and actually I said, I think we should have free dental care on Reese Erlich Day. People talk a lot about the healthcare crisis, but not nearly enough about oral hygiene. And the dentist looked at me with this kind of cold stare. I said, well, how about we compromise, like free teeth cleans on Reese Erlich Day? And so we worked something out. And then I also, in Sicko, do you remember that great scene where we learned that legislators never actually read the bills that they sign or they vote on? And we've known that from other certain things as well. So I figured, I'll see if that's really true. So they asked me to draft a copy, an initial draft of the resolution for Reese Erlich Day. And, whereas, therefore be it resolved, and I actually did put this in the draft, therefore be it resolved that the City Council of Oakland, California will pay for free drinks for anybody within a 10-mile radius of City Hall on Reese Erlich Day, period. Unfortunately, they actually do read the legislation, which is one of the reasons I remain a sober optimist. And they took that part out. But we did, in the process of getting the resolution honoring me, two progressive members of the Oakland City Council introduced a measure calling on the City Council to demand that the Bush administration not invade or otherwise take military action against Iran. And hopefully that will be a motion passed soon. It's kind of working its way through the process now. But also, people are very creative. In each city, in each area, you can come up with your own tactics, things that make sense for your community that will educate people about it. Alternative media is important. I might note, buying my book can be a step in the right direction. But, getting the word out through, you're not going to read the truth about Iran in the New York Times. And I have a whole chapter in my book, actually, that details the manipulation and falsification of facts in the Times and other major media. But there's lots of alternative media out there. You can get the British press online now. BBC and The Guardian are pretty good. Even some of the conservative press, like the Sunday Telegraph, have some interesting articles. There's a lot in the blogosphere. I'm sure you get lots of emails. Now you have to kind of separate out the conspiracy theories from the real stuff, but be a discerning reader as you would of any publication. So there's lots of opportunities to do more education and activism. And I remain a sober optimist because I think there's really no other alternative, because we got to stop this guy before he can get taxi in another country. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you.
So if anyone has a question?
I guess my question is prefaced with a historical comment insofar as the United States provided the nuclear technology to Iran and the bioterrorism to Iraq. And then, of course, we sat around and played cards. But I wonder if you could comment about if we go back to the Eisenhower administration and the Dulles brothers assassinating the truly elected democratic president of Iran, if that could be something you talk about to give a little bit of a backdrop to the crises we're in. Sure.
Yeah, there's actually 2 separate chapters in my book on both of those topics, so I'll just briefly summarize it. It's really interesting. If you go to Iran and say that the United States wants to help bring democracy to the region, people just laugh at you. In this country, there's great practicing of historic amnesia because it's more convenient for those in power. But Iran had a functioning democracy, and not just a country that held elections, and therefore you can claim it's a democracy, but a real functioning democracy in the early 50s. There was freedom of press, there was civil society, there were trade unions, there was vigorous parliamentary debate. Dr. Mossadegh, the prime minister, was a popular figure not only in Iran but around the world. He came to the United States on a tour. Time magazine proclaimed him Man of the Year. I think it was 52. Anyway, somewhere right around in that time. And so Iran had a functioning democracy. They also wanted they wanted to get rid of the unfair oil contracts that had been imposed upon them by the British. And they voted first it was to split the oil revenues 50-50 with the British oil company, and that was roundly rejected. So they said, okay, we'll take it all. And they nationalized the British oil. And it's very interesting. The British did exactly what the United States is doing today. That is, they set up a sanctions regime. In those days, you had to ship the oil out by tanker, not by oil pipeline. And they set up an illegal naval blockade of Iran to prevent the oil. When an Italian oil company sent in a tanker to get it, they seized the Italian oil tanker. I mean, they did all of this stuff that was blatantly illegal at the time to try to make the Mossadegh government fall. They couldn't do it. So finally, and they went to Truman and asked Truman to help them overthrow Mossadegh. Truman refused, to his credit. But the minute Eisenhower got elected and the Dulles brothers came in, they agreed. And even before Eisenhower was formally inaugurated, they already had the plan rolling to overthrow the government of Mossadegh. And they used every dirty trick in the book, including assassinations, kidnapping, terrorist bombings, false terrorist bombings, the whole panoply of tricks. And how do we know this is all true? Because they wrote it up in a very nice report, patting themselves on the back for it, which you can now find online at the New York Times. And there's also a very good book by Stephen Kinzer called All the Shah's Men, if you haven't had a chance to read that one. Excellent summary of that period. And so, the U.S. overthrew the democratic government of Iraq and then brought in the Shah, who immediately arrested and killed and jailed and tortured anybody who had opposed him. And that regime continued till 1979. And the direct result of that CIA action against the democratic government was the Islamic Revolution of 1979. There's exact in a line, and later the seizing of the hostages at the U.S. Embassy is a direct line of causation from there. Had Iran had a democratic government, there would have been no Islamic revolution in 1979. So we can, in very real way, say the U.S. is responsible for that. The other thing that's interesting, of course, is that another example of historic amnesia is the argument goes, Iran can't possibly be only developing nuclear power. They have to be using that as a cover for nuclear bombs, because look at all the oil and gas that Iran has. They don't need a nuclear power. That's the argument by virtually everybody in the United States and the U.S. leadership. In fact, in the 1970s, the Shah said, I'm going to run out of gas and oil at some time. I want to have nuclear power. And the U.S. said, right, and we're going to sell it to you. And the U.S., and you can dig out the documents, again, it's in the book, they virtually insisted that Iran develop nuclear power. And prior to his overthrow, there were 10 contracts for 10 nuclear power plants in Iran that were going to be bought from Germany, the U.S., and France. So at that time, apparently, he needed nuclear power, and the Shah periodically used to talk about how Iran could develop a nuclear bomb, or he'd like to have a nuclear bomb, or something like that. And, of course, he was not denounced by the United States for doing things of that kind. But what happened was he never did develop a nuclear bomb, as far as anybody knows. And the nuclear power plants never got far enough along to actually mean much. And during the Iran-Iraq War, the one reactor that was furthest along got bombed by the Iraqis. So the Iranians were pretty much starting from scratch in the late 80s when they finally decided to, again, try to develop nuclear power. But that's, again, a part of the history that is so embarrassing that when the Washington Post, it's a great quote, the Washington Post called up Henry Kissinger and read him quotes from classified documents about him urging Iran to have nuclear power. And the Washington Post reporter asked Kissinger, how does that square with your current position? And she said, there was a very long pause. and old Henry said, well, at the time, he was an ally, and this did not enter into the question. So in other words, it was okay then because we liked it, and it's not okay now because we don't like it. A brief summary of U.S. policy.
Okay, I just wondered, what is your opinion on the true motivation if the U.S. does go to war against Iran? What do you think they're exactly trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I think that what they want to do is they want to overthrow the current government in Iran and bring in a pro-U.S. government.
Okay, just, I mean, but if they bring in a pro-U.S. government, to what end? I mean,
yes.
what are they looking for specifically?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. If you hold up a sign at a anti-war rally and you say, no war for oil, you're denounced as a conspiracy theorist, and how can you possibly say that? That's not, we're fighting for democracy and against weapons of mass, right? All right. I went back to Washington, and I sat down with the former national intelligence officer for Iran and the Mid East and Southeast Asia, and the guy, in other words, who was in charge of intelligence for the CIA for Iran from 2000 to 2005. And I had the same conversation with the guy, several ambassadors and former State Department officials and so on. And I say, what are the U.S. national interests in Iran? The first answer on everybody's list was oil. You just have to know how to ask the question. And what they mean by that is the U.S. has to have control of strategic resources around the world, and oil is important. So you have to have a control or pro-U.S. governments in key oil-producing countries like Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Then you have to have either pipelines or secure pipelines or shipping lines, which means you got to have a navy there, or military bases, or preferably both. And since you want to deny competitors who you make up all kinds of evil things about the access to that oil, well, then you need an even larger military to keep them out, and so on. So pretty soon you have this whole empire structure, which in fact is what we have. And that need for so-called national interest, the argument they make is, well, we, the American people, need it because we have to drive our cars and fire our electricity plants and so on. And in the old days, they used to say, you know, if we don't have that, if we don't have U.S. influence in the Middle East, gasoline might go to $3 a gallon. For some reason, that argument doesn't hold so much water anymore. And under current policy, gasoline is going up and it's going to continue to go up. And of course, if the U.S. bombs Iran, it's going to go even sky higher. No, the countries like Sweden and Switzerland manage somehow to get their natural gas and oil by buying it on the open markets. They don't have to have fleets of aircraft carriers off the coast of Iran. They buy it on the open market. So could the United States. So it's about oil. It's about politics. It's about geopolitical control. Iran is a critical region partway between the Middle East and Asia. It's all of those issues. So you have a pro-U.S. guy in power, and he makes sure U.S. oil companies get the contracts on favorable terms. You make sure that he gives military bases. You make sure that U.S. mercenaries cannot be prosecuted under local law, or U.S. soldiers, etc. There's a whole series of conditions that go with that when you get a pro-U.S. guy in power. And we see that in Iraq.
If the U.S. were to bomb Iran, what would be the position of Russia or China? Would they just sit idly by, maybe say a few things, or would they be a little more belligerent?
They certainly wouldn't engage in any military activity, and I think they would denounce it. They would criticize it. I would expect a reaction very similar to what happened when the U.S. invaded Iraq. Which is that it was criticized. They did not vote for it at the UN. I mean, realistically, they're not in a position to take on the United States and fight them off. Maybe China will resupply Iran with some weapons, perhaps. But militarily, there's not a whole lot they can do.
I have two quick questions. I want to ask you to talk about two things. A large percentage of the Iranian population is so young, and so that's hopeful that they could change the government. But the way the government's set up, it just seems to me it's so closed. Like, what are the hopes for any real change? And the second thing is the need for alternative energy in Iran, because they may run out.
I've devoted the entire talk tonight to why Iran is not a threat, certainly not an immediate threat, either to the United States or to Israel, which is not to say that Iran has a good government or that the people of Iran particularly like the government. They don't. It is a repressive regime run by a combination of clergy, wealthy business people, and a military intelligence elite. And they hold elections, but it's certainly not democratic. And you can see that in all kinds of ways. That anecdote I gave about the woman complaining about inflation, the high unemployment, the fact that independent unions are illegal, that students can't demonstrate, women's rights groups can't demonstrate, and so on. So I did interview Shirin Ebadi, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and various other leaders of all of those movements that I talked about, and they're to the best of their ability. It is very difficult to organize. There's for a variety of internal reasons they're not as well organized as they have been in the past. But two, the fact of what Bush and the U.S. is doing makes their job 10 times harder, because when they go out, for example, to hold a peaceful demonstration for women's rights, the first thing the government does is say, aha, these people are taking money from the United States. Don't believe them. They're troublemakers. And of course the government would say that anyway to anybody who opposes them, but it has a certain bounce in the people. There's a certain credibility to it, because the United States is waging that covert war that I told you about before. They are funding, trying to find money, to get money to NGOs and other groups in Iran through under-the-table means. They do fund propaganda broadcasts to Iran, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some basis on which people say, well, maybe that's true, even though it's certainly exaggerated, and used as an excuse by the government. So that combination makes it difficult to organize opposition in Iran. But every single one of those opposition leaders that I talked to said The best thing the United States can do for us, if you want to help our struggle for human rights and workers' rights and women's rights, is to keep your hands off the country. Not only don't bomb, stop the sanctions, stop the evil resolutions in the UN, et cetera, and return this frozen assets that Iran has. In other words, return to some kind of normal relations and let us, the movement activists of Iran, take care of making change here. And that makes perfect sense to me. Of course, the Bush administration is not interested in that because the people who actually have some kind of base in Iran for making change are not going to be any more pro-U.S. than the current government. So they want a pro-U.S. strongman in power. They don't want democracy. Now, there was a second question about alternative energy. Yes. Okay. All right. So now this gets really interesting because I did ask a lot of people on my 3 trips to Iran, why nuclear power? Okay. Let's accept for a moment that you're not developing nuclear bombs, right? Why nuclear power? It's not safe environmentally, et cetera, et cetera. There is almost no debate in Iran about nuclear power. It's just the government says it's safe, end of story. There's no environmental movement to speak of. There's not much opposition to it. Iran does need to diversify its energy sources. That's true. But I personally am an opponent of nuclear power. I don't think it's a great idea for the United States. I don't think it's a great idea for Iran. And Iran is probably going to end up importing some of these Russian nuclear reactors that brought us such things as Chernobyl. And they don't have a place to store the nuclear waste. I mean, and transporting it, and it's a third world country. I mean, it's problematic enough in the United States, let alone when you transfer that kind of technology to a third world country. But, so, people do talk about wind power and solar power and so on, but as far as I can tell, the government isn't seriously looking into any of that. They're putting a lot of their bets on nuclear power, in my opinion, unfortunately.
My question, I guess it's just one question, but earlier you talked about how the Democratic candidates, are supporting this policy in Iran, but I'm also curious how you think the Bush administration might use this, considering the manipulations of the elections in the past. Right. If you see, and the expansion of presidential power during wartime and the war on terror, if you foresee them using this, or foresee Bush and the neocons using this, declaring a state of emergency and trying to stay in power, if you foresee that, or if that's just...
You mean like postpone the elections? That
either
kind of
postpone them, or if you
them,
see Bush trying to stay somehow.
I have to say, I don't see that. First of all, are they capable of it? You betcha. These folks are capable of anything. They've torn up shredded the Constitution already. But that would be a pretty big step, even for sectors of the military and the state bureaucracy and so on. That would be, it's one thing to falsify the Florida elections through a lot of manipulations. It's quite another just to stop holding them all together, right? I could see a situation, but that doesn't, short of that, yeah, there's lots of things. We've already, they've laid the legal grounds for declaring anybody an enemy combatant. So I don't think it's on the horizon, but is it possible that Cindy Sheehan and other leading anti-war activists would suddenly be declared enemy combatants because they've spoken too outspoken against the war? The U.S. has a history of doing things like that in the past. It's perfectly possible. But again, I'm not predicting that will happen. I think they're really focused right now on the very, very difficult situation for the U.S. military in Iraq, and then what's going to happen after Iran. And if there's a very large outspoken movement in this country against it, that would make those kind of repressive actions all the more difficult. Thank you.
Okay, some quick thank yous. I just wanted to say some quick thank yous to the wonderful people at the Iran Working Group, Lana, Eshi, Nasreen, and Joan, who helped so much with this, putting this together, and Mickey Lynn, Women Against War. Thank you all for coming. Have a good night.